Why do you say that, Father? You aren't afraid, are you?
No, but I respect some of the superstitions of others. Often they are founded in fact.
Broadcasting live from our Sanctum Sanctorum in Venice, California. This is the Sixth Sense Society. I'm your host, Krista, here with our producer, Michael, and today we are doing our own show on folk remedies and superstitions. We're going to be talking about the most bizarre remedies to very practical remedies, as well as some interesting superstitions. But before we get started, Michael has a few announcements.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our broadcast. And yes, I'm getting older, and yes, I'm wearing reading glasses today, so because it's one of those things. So unfortunately, Krista and I are counting the months to Social Security. But we plan on being around for many years and keeping you guys entertained. So coming up, we have next week a couple of new guests, new friends that we've made, Caroline Marshall and Marnie Olson, who are both astrologers. So it'll be an astrology show, and I'm sure Krista can give us a little hint as to what they might be talking about. And then coming up soon, we've just confirmed our good friend Kristen Harris from Salem, Massachusetts, who's going to be doing a show with us on the Salem witch trials. So some really great stuff coming up, and we'll have more guests in October and November. Some of our paranormal friends will be back. We're hoping for Haunted History BC and Mystic Mitten and so forth, some of your favorites. So tune in for that. Get all the information on our website, sixthsensesociety.com, SIXTH, all spelled out. And while you're there, if you can afford to, buy us a coffee on Ko-Fi. Helps us cover some of our costs, and we do appreciate it. And if you can't afford it, we love having you anyway. So tune in, because we really enjoy our fans, and we really enjoy entertaining you guys. And so I don't want to take up too much time, because this is going to be a really fun topic. I've been looking forward to doing it. So with that, I'm going to kick it back to you, Krista. So take it away, Krista.
Great. Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking to these two lovely ladies about the U.S. chart. They both said they've been obsessed with it. So I'm not sure which one they used, but I wanted to shout with glee since I've been obsessed with it too. So it's going to be great as part of the show to talk about what's happening in the United States astrology chart. So let's get going on the topic. And, you know, one of the things about this topic is the more you look at it or think about it or read about, superstitions and remedies come to your own mind that you just sort of take for granted. So for instance, for me, one of the, home remedies I use is lavender on the pillow at night to go to sleep. And I've been using it for years, and lavender has many other uses. So that's kind of a very simple one. We're going to talk about some very unusual ones too, drawing some from a really cool book by Helen Creighton called Blue Nose Magic for some of them. But I did want to sort of talk first about what is a home remedy or folk remedy. It's an interchangeable word. And I did look it up in a medical dictionary, because sometimes it's a good place to start is a dictionary, and it had a good definition. It says a traditional therapy often utilizing natural products, nutritional supplements, or physical measures. Its effectiveness may be supported by familial, local, or culturally accepted stories or rituals. So that's the part I found interesting, is that in the definition itself, gathering stories from local people and different cultures is legitimate, really. What do you think about that, Michael?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, growing up on the East Coast, it's just, there's a lot of that stuff. We had a lot of folk remedies. Some of it is valid. I think some of it has I think medicine would show some legitimacy. Others maybe a little more questionable. And I've often thought some remedies are just plain disgusting, so that you'll say, no, I'm feeling much better, and go back to work because I don't want to drink any more of that damn stuff, that was pretty horrid. So I think that's also part of it. But there was a really interesting one. We were reading the book, doing the research, and one of the things that I found captivating is she has a number of people that talk about being charmed. And one of the really interesting ones was for stopping bleeding. And I mean severe stuff. People would gash themselves with a saw or something, and the person would go to this person who had this charm to stop bleeding, and they would say a few words, some kind of an incantation. It didn't even involve any medicine or anything. And they would say, okay, by the time you get home, the bleeding will have stopped. In many cases, it did, and stuff that probably shouldn't without a lot of stitches and sutures. So, and these are people telling this firsthand that they experienced this, and that one really fascinates me. So I don't know what you think about that, but that one really caught my eye.
Yes, that one totally caught my eye because there was more than one account. And what we're drawing from for this particular example is the Blue Nose Magic, where Helen Creighton went around and she interviewed and collected interviews from different people, sort of in, I guess, probably the Northeast area, so Nova Scotia area. And I love she quotes from the people. So here's one example about nosebleeds. So it wasn't quite as intense, but here it goes. Miss Mary Ann Silver gave a man a strip of paper about 3 or 4 inches long with words on it, and he had to keep it in his pocket. His daily nosebleed stopped even when he hid the paper. But a lot of times, the words were not passed on, or the person forgot to pass on the words. The other one I really liked was grandfather at Owl's Head. Now, doesn't that already sound super magical? He could charm for blood. You could go to him even if you were bleeding to death. He wouldn't have to see the person. He would say, it's all right now, you can go back, and it would be all right. Now, because there's so many examples, you just think that it must have been true.
Yeah, and the other thing that's really interesting about it was in some cases, apparently this charm or this incantation, they claim was passed on to them by Native American people as well, and that they were only allowed to share it with one other person or something. So there was a lot of that. I did notice that in some instances they said for it to work that you would have to have faith in the magic or faith in the charm, and if you didn't have sufficient faith, then it wouldn't work. And so, that may well be true. I think if something is something you don't believe in, how much of your own energy you're going to put into it if you don't believe it's possible. Well, but I also think that sometimes that gives the practitioner a note as well, if it didn't work, that, well, clearly you didn't have enough faith.
That's true, except that now I remember seeing a documentary on the placebo effect, that it's actually a very real thing. And there was in this documentary an example of someone that was cured of something and then for whatever reason lost the faith in the cure and the illness came back. And it was like a really long sort of segment in this, and they were saying they're actually studying it now, that there is an effect. And so to me, the placebo effect is an example of just having faith.
Yeah, for sure. And then, but there was another example in her book that it was for asthma. If you remember the guy that had asthma, and for whatever reason, it seems like putting your hair in a tree cures asthma. There's a lot of stories about that. So this guy was told to go to this tree and put his back against it and drill a hole in it and put some of his hair into the tree, and his asthma would go away, and apparently it did. And then somebody who didn't like him, I guess, came along and cut down the tree so his asthma would return, and it did. So I thought that was a really funny story.
That was an odd one, too. Now, one that caught my temple, it caught my temple, maybe because of the head thing just mentioned. It caught my attention is something called the King's Evil. And maybe because Queen Elizabeth just died and how there's magic associated with royalty through history. So anyway, what this is basically it's connected to a form of tuberculosis, which would swell the lymph glands, and it was supposedly this thing called the King's Evil would cure it. And there's some horrible pictures of these huge lumps in people's throats. And it's basically connected to royalty touching people. Now, it was taken very seriously. Charles II is said to have touched more than 90,000 victims between 1660 and 1682. Now, I found this in Britannica, not the Helen Creighton's book. And the last royal healer in England was Queen Anne, who touched 200 victims in 1712. And so part of one of the remedies of King's Evil is also put a 10-cent piece in water and use this water to bathe child's neck. So many days, the water will turn black. And it's also more effective if it's done by the seventh son. So you can it's not really exactly royalty touching the person, but it's the coins. But this idea of royalty kind of caught my attention, the magic of being touched by someone royal, which we continue today when we meet famous people. And if even when you see in crowds where people are meeting famous people, or they want to touch them, or they want to be touched. And if you think about it, that's not such a great idea during a pandemic, particularly, because, the germs passing. But I was sort of intrigued by that whole notion. And where did it really come from that if somebody has a royal energy, like they're super well known in a field, or in this case, the king or queen, why do we think that's going to heal us?
Yeah, but one of the interesting things, though, is that the people that we're talking about being charmed, especially for the stopping of the blood, the person doing the charm or incantation didn't have to physically even be present with the person. They could be a considerable distance away. And so the person that was actually experiencing the bleeding would have had no interaction with this person whatsoever. So, I mean, laying hands on it is a powerful thing. I think touch is a powerful thing. But again, I'm just floored by the idea that somebody from miles away, who the person isn't even in the presence of, could stop you from bleeding, with some kind of a charm or incantation.
Well, the stopping from the bleeding is the one that's most dramatic. But my father has talked about, because my father does long distance healing, and he's talked about what people have experienced. And he's also talked about what he's experienced when someone's done healing from a distance. And unfortunately, you could be quite fraudulent, but there are, sensations and things people pick up. I remember one time I used to do some Reiki on Michael now and then, and just, to kind of practice and keep it going, because I took the first 2 degrees when I was really young. And I do believe in energy healing. And then one time I'd stopped working on him. I don't know if you remember this. And I think I moved towards the front of the room, and you could still feel my hand on you. And because you mentioned something like that. So that was really kind of odd. But yeah, it is the fact that they could stop the bleeding. I've never heard of a charm like that. That one really makes me want to go do more research on it.
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff that you read is stuff that we commonly still use, even in our household. One of the things I was reading was that for colds and so forth, peppermint tea. And, we keep peppermint tea in our home and chamomile tea still. If my belly's upset or something, we have some of that. So I think there definitely is some legitimacy to it. But the charm thing is just absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah, and the fact that they didn't consider themselves witches or anything, they just were people that could charm. So that was another thing. Now, animals, there are some strange things with animals, both live animals and also dung. For instance, there's a lot of remedies using different forms of cow dung. In this case, for jaundice, you're supposed to drink goose dung that's been steeped. And it sort of blew my mind. I was like, who thought of that? Why would you do that?
Yeah, and that's one of those ones I was talking about, the idea that, goose dung and molasses as a tea or something for a cold, is taken by the spoonful, it says, for a cold. Dear God, somebody's feeding me goose crap for a cold. Like I said, suddenly my cold's going to be feeling a whole lot better. I'm going back to work. I don't want any more of that. So I think some of it is very motivational.
Well, there is that modern day urine therapy thing that people at the Bodhi Tree used to do, I think. A couple people I know that. I don't remember exactly what it is, but basically you do drink your urine.
Yeah, and certainly there are some odd practices, and who knows, maybe there's some legitimacy in it. There's antibodies or something carried in it, God knows. But I do think it's interesting. The other one that I thought was kind of fascinating for colds is the idea of putting fish on your feet. And there are several illnesses, including just common colds, where apparently if you strap herring to your feet, it's supposed to help cure the cold. And I can't imagine walking around work with herrings strapped to my feet, trying to cure my cold. But I guess, it's your thing.
Yeah, that one, there was a lot of, of course, some of the stories come from fishermen, and there's definitely a lot of things with fish as a result. But that one was kind of odd. The other thing is some of the ways they use animals that don't quite make sense. So for goiter, supposedly you bind a live frog on your throat until the frog dies. And that's supposed to be as if the frog, okay, so this is interesting. The frog would absorb whatever is causing the goiter. Now, frogs of some kind can absorb things through their skin and repel things through their skin. That's what makes them poisonous. So maybe it's based on something that on that idea.
Yeah, perhaps. And like I said, there are a lot of very strange things. Again, it's one of those things. I can't imagine going around with a frog strapped to my throat waiting for it to die either. And it's as an animal lover, I think that would be a hard one for me. But again, what must the world have looked like back in the day?
Yeah, and another one that was really interesting is one connected to black cats. And this one, it doesn't make any sense. It says for shingles, you rub on blood from the tail of a pure black cat, or you put a black cat's tail around a person, which I assume the tail is taken off the cat, so the poor cat's dead probably. And there's supposed to be this old saying, if shingles met was present death. There's a saying, and somehow the tail of a black cat, that doesn't really make sense even at all, considering what shingles is.
Yeah, and then I was reading one for an earache, where you're supposed to blow smoke in the person's ear for an earache, and I've heard that one before, actually. Again, I don't know if that's a healthy practice or not, but again, that's what was commonly done back in the day.
Now, because I really love potatoes and I have some Irish in me, I was sort of drawn to looking up potato remedies. And it started with Blue Nose Magic Book, and there was some for arthritis and rheumatism. She says, carry a potato. It won't decay but dry up. So this is to help with arthritis and rheumatism. And then a blue potato for rheumatism specifically. And then I looked up in the Farmer's Almanac, had some interesting, sounds like they might even work, remedies. So for instance, one was a silverware cleaner. So you use the water from the boiling potatoes to clean tarnished silverware. You let the water cool, soak the silverware in it for 30 minutes, then wash and dry it. There was also a skin remedy using potatoes, a sunburn soother, a splinter remover. That was interesting because you cut a potato into thin slices and you place the slice on the splinter, and you're supposed to leave it there from 10 to 20 minutes, or you can also leave it overnight, so you'd have to bandage it. So then when you take it off eventually, supposedly the splinter will just slide out. So that could have to do with sort of the juices from the potato. So I thought that was just kind of fun. And you can see that there's a lot of folk remedies connected to ordinary food that people had that was pretty much easy for them to have and inexpensive.
Well, that's very true. And what's happening basically is that you don't have modern pharmacies, probably couldn't afford to go to a doctor. And we're talking often very small little fishing villages and communities with maybe 50 or 60 people in some cases, or 80, a couple hundred at the most. So they're kind of working with what they've got. And I think many of these things, who knows, there might be some legitimacy to some of it, but I think that they really were kind of working with what they had access to much of the time.
Well, I think when it comes to food remedies, there have been proven legitimacy with some of the folk remedies, and you see that connected to the modern alternative healing community. So you'll see the properties, say, of dill or parsley, and also Edgar Cayce, who became famous because of some of the remedies he suggested many were folk remedies, some very unusual, that actually saved people's lives. And so he helped to really bring forward in a larger way and even back some of these concepts of folk remedies actually working and being more effective at times than some of the pharmaceutical. And I think also folk remedies has no agenda. So unfortunately, pharmaceuticals, even though I do believe in modern drugs, they have such an agenda that they will sometimes even prevent the research of legitimate, easily found sources because there's no money in it.
Yeah, now I'm not as familiar with Cayce as you are. But again, was he also involved with sort of this distance healing, which kind of, again, fascinates me when it comes right down to it. And I know he was definitely doing some psychic stuff, but I'm not really sure about his healing stuff.
And most of his healing things, from what I know, that he became famous were actual physical remedies. He would find, like, some of them were really incredible because they would literally sound dangerous, and he would go into his sleep state to get these remedies for people. And he was really big on using castor oil, I remember. And you can access all of this information if you become a Cayce member, which is not very expensive. But my dad uses my dad who's 91 and healthy, he uses a mix of Western medicine and folk remedies. And I know one he recommended for me was for arthritis to put, or at least joint pain. He's saying that for him, when he started having joint pain, he put a mix of, I think it's almond oil and peanut oil, and you put that on it. He said for him it worked. He says you have to, one of the things about folk remedies, you often have to apply it a lot more. So it's a lot, a little bit more time consuming. But from what I can tell so far, as far as like healing and distance healing, I'm not sure he was well known for that. He was known for actual like literal remedies.
Mm. Now, one of the ones I was just reading, which I might try the next time. I don't very often have headaches, but every once in a while I'll get one. And it says, for a headache, get a piece of brown paper and saturate it with vinegar, and then tie a handkerchief around the forehead over the paper. So I guess you wear the paper on your forehead like a cap. Now, vinegar has a very strong aroma, and I think some of these things, again, maybe there's something to that, because I know that with the lavender, it certainly does help you to sometimes relax and sleep better and so forth, the aroma about it. And there's such a stimulation that comes with aroma in so many respects and how it affects the body. And certainly vinegar is going to have a very, very, very strong aroma.
I think, and I think modern science has looked at some of the properties of like the foods that are recommended, and there are things in the chemical makeup of that would really affect, the biology of us. So I think that there is truth, and science can sort of, examine it. And you can see that happening even with treatments of cancer. There's much more nutritional aids in the healing of cancer. So they like green tea, I know is recommended, and cutting back on sugar. And so they're incorporating that in with the other aspects of treating cancer now as the nutritional support.
Yeah. Now, another common ingredient, and for upset stomachs and things like that, and there were several ailments for which I think it was mentioned as being helpful, which kind of surprised me a little bit, was catnip. And you see that is very commonly used for a number of ailments, but especially, as I said, it says catnip tea for cramps in stomach, or if your baby's upset. I guess you're supposed to feed the baby catnip tea. But again, very unusual, and I wouldn't have thought really was medicinal.
Yeah, there's a lot with catnip in that one book. I have to admit that made me want to go and look and see what was actually in the catnip. The other thing, I was really drawn to just common foods like onions, which I do recall somewhere reading years ago how onions can absorb germs, and so that was one of that's true. So one of the uses is you put a piece of cut onion in a room and it will absorb the germs. And then there's also poultices, of course, are hugely popular, which Casey and even Susan Weed in her books, herbal books, which are amazing, a lot of poultices are still used to draw things out. And this one was a poultice of hot fried onion placed on the chest for pneumonia. And, I think we have some modern versions of it, but I think they're still used and can be helpful in certain ailments like colds and things like that. The other thing about another popular thing to deal with or try to find cures for were warts. And so you can supposedly have an onion over your wart. And then here's where you get the charmed idea. Say the 3 highest names in the Bible, and as the onion rots away, your wart will rot. So that's what's interesting, and what I really like about the folk remedies is there's not this delineation between magic or charms and the physical. There's more of that togetherness, and there's more of also, to me, really looking at the whole person, which having been going to the doctor more recently, when the Western doctor, I'm really feeling they just pick me apart. No one ever asks me for all of my symptoms. It's like they just say, okay, your knee hurts, we're going to send you to this person. And you've got this, lump on your tongue, we're going to send you to the tongue specialist. And I don't mind specialists, but the fact that they don't sit down and look at you as a whole person anymore in Western, at least the modern Western people I've been going to, it's a little disturbing.
Yeah, no, you brought up something interesting. And before we go on too much further, just to mention again, the book that we're getting a lot of our information from, which I think is highly recommendable, is by Dr. Helen Creighton. And it's called Blue Nose Magic. She wrote a couple of Blue Nose Ghosts, which are ghost stories, and Blue Nose Magic. But she was an anthropologist, a PhD, and she spent a lot of time traveling around Nova Scotia in particular, where I was born and grew up, talking to the people and gathering a lot of these stories and so forth to preserve them. And it's just a very, very entertaining book for sure. So I would highly recommend it. And she was an interesting character in her own right. And you can look her up online. But it is interesting what you mentioned, too, that some of the cures and a lot of the superstitions sort of tie into biblical belief, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, and those names having the power to cure, or certain things that had to deal with not setting sail on a certain day of the week because it was somehow associated with something in Christianity where Christ was killed and it was a bad idea or something to do things. So you do see a lot of religious sort of undercurrent when it comes to some of these beliefs as well.
Yeah, it's true. And we are magical people, and I didn't grow up religious, and I do feel that working with a deity that you have confidence in, that you feel a connection to, has a powerful effect on the psyche. And I do think it has to be, you have to feel that relationship, just like the idea you have to have faith in the practitioner who's charming you. I think you have to feel a connection to the specific deity. And probably one of the problems with people is sometimes they're forced through family or culture to really connect to a deity they don't feel a connection to.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point too, is any kind of a practice you're doing, if you don't really have faith in your magic, faith in your practice, and believe it's possible, then you're probably wasting a lot of your time and energy, because I do think it's important. Now, that doesn't mean that you should be naive and not judge things with a critical mind, but I think that there's room for both. I think you can be a healthy skeptic, but still be open to possibility and have some faith and confidence and belief in giving something an honest effort. But that definitely seems to be an important factor in many of these cures, is that people kind of believed in it. And as you said, whether that's the placebo effect or not, whether there's some real medicinal value in some of these things, who can say? But I do think that, again, as I said, if you don't believe in something, why are you doing it, is when it comes right down to it.
Well, you can also look at the political angle of folk remedies that still exist, is because a lot of folk remedies also come through indigenous cultures. And that idea of the quote unquote civilizing force looking down on these remedies, to me, is something that is not healthy. And then, like we said, there's also the class thing we talked about a lot of times. When people didn't have money, they came up with some of the solutions because they had to. But I don't think it was all related to class. I think some of it comes from indigenous roots. And I mean, even indigenous cultures within Europe, the ones that are more the country people, and that kind of looking down on that, which I think we're beginning to see is really to our own detriment.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at modern pharmaceuticals, a great many times it's based on, extracts from plants, from nature, that they find has medicinal purposes and cures and so forth. And we're seeing that now with people getting into things like medical marijuana and now I think it's Washington State that's looking at microdosing, allowing microdosing with psilocybin, the psychedelic mushrooms, yeah. And they find that microdosing with it is a very effective way of treating depression, that it has a very positive medicinal aspect to it. And like anything else, I mean, things can be abused and whatnot, but there does seem to be some truth in the idea that many of these plants do have some significant medicinal purpose and benefit to the body.
Well, another group that really combines the element of magic and charms in its own way with plants is biodynamic farming. If you look up so Rudolf Steiner in it was like the early 1900s, he was clairvoyant and he saw that already that the soils were being depleted. And so he came up with these, really, they sound like magical concoctions to help the soil. And I don't remember some of them, but they use they'll use like the liver of a deer or something, and they'll put different herbs, and then they bury it in the soil for a long time. And it works. The soil becomes much more richer because of the nutrients. And they also worked very much with the elementals and the divas and again, the proof was in the pudding because the biodynamic products are amazingly nutritious. So he also proves that there is combining the magical with the specific supplements and working on that level has potentially a very powerful effect.
I think it's kind of interesting too, and you kind of alluded to this a little bit at the beginning, that the people that were doing these charms and using these potions and poultices and so forth never considered themselves witches. That was almost a profane term. But at the same time, essentially that's what witches have been doing over the centuries, is curing with herbs and charms and so forth. And so it really is no different. But I think that, again, you see probably the influence of Christianity. They would have considered themselves good Christians. So to use the term witch would have been unthinkable. But essentially, there's really very little or no difference, in the two.
Yeah, that was one of the things that surprised me, that they used that word charmed. And also, it was dangerous to call yourself a witch, depending on what period you were living in. You could be tortured and killed. So it might be another reason why they shied away from it. But yeah, I think that, and since we're speaking about witches, let's talk about one of my favorite superstitions, or one of my favorite animals connected to superstitions is the black cat. Now, Michael and I, we adopted a black cat, or it really adopted us, and I give Michael full credit for it. So why don't you share the story of how we got our black cat?
Yeah, for sure. We were driving down Venice Boulevard toward home, and we hadn't really even discussed the idea of getting a pet or anything at that point. And as we're kind of approaching Lincoln, I just get this sudden feeling that we need to go to the animal shelter and adopt a cat. And it just struck me out of nowhere, we need to go now. And so off we went, and we turned, and we went over to Santa Monica to the animal shelter that was closest by. And the first time we walked through, we didn't really, see anything or connect with any animal. But on the way back through, there was this little tiny black old cat sort of cowering in the back of a cage. And it just really struck us that this was meant to be with us. And she did end up coming home with us. And she was quite elderly when we picked her up, but she lived with us for many more years. And she was such a magical creature. And when they adopted us, they gave us some cat toys to go with it. One was a little Felix the Cat bag of magic, which I thought was really amazing, And if there's ever an omen, that was probably one. And then it was on a full moon
Yes.
at the same time. And she was a very magical creature, to be sure. And I have a medicine bag that I wear frequently that I've had for 20 plus years, that was made for me by a native friend back in Nova Scotia. And I've added to it over the years, a few of my own things. And at one point I was laying down, and she actually came and sat on my chest and then reached up to her mouth and broke off one of her claws and laid it on the chest for me to put in the bag. So one of her little claws is in there, and it was really a very deliberate act. And then as she got very elderly, she was getting to the end of her life. And she actually made an effort to sort of come spend some time with us, even though she was very feeble at that point. And then when she passed away, she also passed on a full moon. So, she was just an amazing, if you want to believe in familiars, she was without a doubt a familiar.
It's so true. We named her Cabot after Lori Cabot from Salem. We thought that would honor her. And she was the sweetest, and she had big green eyes on top of it all. And I think we were even discussing getting a dog before Michael heard her call out to us, and definitely was the right home for a magical cat. Once in a while, we would do some kind of a working, and she seemed to like it. The thing that was really funny, though, was one night I woke up. She was not a big meower. I woke up, and in front of the altar in the dark, she looked like she was talking to a spirit. She was going meow, 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 meow. And I never forgot it. I was like, what did she see? And I think cats are generally magical, but black cats, they are considered both lucky and unlucky. And what started at least this is one of the theories of what started the problem with black cats was actually Pope Gregory IX, who he had an official church document called Vox in Roma, and in it he said that black cats were declared an incarnation of Satan. So it was because of that decree that it got to be very serious about black cats. They thought the black cats were witches in disguise, which personally they could have been, I think. But he was the one that really laid it out. Okay, you guys, black cats specifically. And then also because ironically, because they killed the black cats who they thought were spreading the plague, the opposite was true because they were killing the rats and mice that were spreading the plague, and it made it worse by killing the black cats. Prior to that, the black cat has been seen as fortunate because it's associated with the Bastet, the Egyptian black cat. So that, that was, I think, associated with fertility and health and protection, something like that. And in our case, once we got the little black cat Cabot, we were living in a very small place and it was not a good thing. And after we got her, we found our first good home. And for us, she was completely lucky.
Yeah, but I think you see this in different cultures too, and in some cases, black is considered evil. If you look at Japan, if you were to pick somebody up in a white limousine, they would be offended because white is the color of funerals, where it's black over here. So it's a big cultural difference. We often consider the number 13 to be unlucky, but in some of the Scandinavian countries, it's actually considered one of the luckiest numbers. So really, there's a lot of cultural influences that come into play. And I think in North America in particular, in the European culture of North America, you can't get away with the idea that Christianity is a big influence in a lot of our superstitions and beliefs. And I think very much colors the way that we look at things. I think the number 13, again, we think of the 12 apostles with Christ being the 13th, and it didn't end well for him. So 13 became kind of unlucky. So again, that there's a lot of religious tie-in. And I really do think that we don't sometimes, I think, realize in our society how much to this day, even if we don't think it does, that's still a major influence.
You definitely see that with the black cat, the idea of it crossing your path. Some people think it's unlucky. Magical people think it's lucky. But even before today, there's definitely different opinions about black cats in different cultures. And some, even in some European countries, it's not all bad. Like, for instance, in France, it was said something magical is about to happen. If you see a black cat in Scotland, you'll have prosperity if one appears at your doorway or on your porch. And then if it's walking towards you, it's good luck. If it appears in your dreams, it's good luck. And then if it's got a one white hair on it, which I thought was interesting, then it's particularly good luck. Several cultures believe black cats walking away from you is bad luck. But you think about it, that makes sense, because if it's coming to you, it's good luck. It means that your good luck is leaving. So that one's a little consistent. And then sailors, now I think there's a totally disagreement about having cats on board, but in Europe, sailors will have a safe journey if they bring along a black cat. So it depends on, I think, what kind of sailor you're off. Cats are good or not, particularly a black cat. So it's mixed with the black cat, I would say. But it's sad because on Halloween, they still recommend, if you have a black cat, that you bring your black cat in, because some people will sacrifice them.
Yeah, for sure. And please don't do that. We love animals. We don't want to see harm come to them, and keep them safe.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think so much it again comes back to your own beliefs. If you believe something to be lucky, it's probably going to bring you some luck. And if you believe it to be unlucky, it's probably not going to be a good thing. So a lot of it's going to come down to the power of your own mind to sort of shape and create your own reality and how you perceive it. So I think that's why there's no maybe perhaps one conclusive idea about any of this stuff too. And then speaking of sailors, my father was actually a fisherman and a sailor. He started at age 14 on a tall ship and would fish out of dories on the Grand Banks off Newfoundland. And if you can imagine making a living in an 18-foot flat-bottom rowboat 100 miles offshore. And then they would sail to the West Indies and so forth. And I can tell you, fishermen and sailors got to be some of the most superstitious people on the planet, But I also think that you're in a perilous situation much of the time, and superstition is part of what gives you the strength and the courage to face those adverse conditions.
Absolutely. It totally makes sense. And then it makes sense too if, like for instance, there was something going on and you were saved from a storm, that you want to repeat that, because the ocean is so powerful and you're so at its mercy that, of course, I would become superstitious. Though I do like some of the superstitions, like the one where the sailors believe that all seagulls are old sailors that have returned. And I've heard them talk about that on Deadliest Catch.
Yeah, and there definitely is that belief that seabirds in general, we think of albatross as being something that's associated with misfortune by a lot of sailors, and you hear that even saying in our language of having an albatross around your neck or something. So again, that there is an association with all of that, and I'm sure that there's a reason for that. That they observed something that struck them in some way as being profound, and it made an influence, and it sort of helped to create the myth.
Well, bird augury, I did a show on for Spell It Out. It can have some merit to it because of the fact that birds and animals see things in nature coming that we don't see. And so that the study of it over time can actually be, some of it can be legitimate, I think, because they have senses that we don't. Some birds have visions that we don't. They see things literally we don't see.
Yeah, and I also think back in the day, people were much more connected to nature in many ways, that they were chopping wood and doing things and being a part of it. And I think now I sit at my desk behind my computer, and that's the closest I get to connecting with nature some days, and I'm sure some of us do make more of an effort than I do. But at the same time, our lifestyles have changed so greatly, and I think now we rely on CVS Pharmacy. It's convenient, it's down the street. And back in the day, again, I think people were much more connected to nature. I think in the East Coast, where I come from, the Northeast especially, connection to the seasons, which I don't think we have quite as much here in LA. But again, these things, I think, really shaped our beliefs a great deal, and certainly our superstitions and our remedies and cures.
It's so true. And I think you can, however, even in the city, make an effort to go out and connect to nature. For instance, Venice has a lot of flowers and trees and birds and insects, and it's amazing, like how afraid people are of things they don't know. So, for instance, those big green June bugs that look like scarabs, I adore them, but they fly in a very bumbly way, and they make a loud noise. And several times, people have been screaming when they see them. I stopped to educate a group of young high school girls because they were terrified. I picked it up. They're very docile. They'll climb on your hand. They don't sting. They don't bite. And they're beautiful, actually. And once you look at them, you can see they look like scarabs. And they were still afraid, even though I was handling it and telling them they're safe. And I thought, wow, they're that removed from their own backyard. And I think that is a definite mistake because there's so much wonder out there. And there's some things I'm not going to pick up, but it's good to know so that you don't go and pick up a poisonous spider, Yeah,
there was one other little remedy that I did want to mention since we got on the topic of talking about my dad. And he was actually born just outside of Lunenburg in Nova Scotia, which is an incredible part of the world. And it's very German, and its ancestry, that part of Nova Scotia. And it says that for intoxication, you would eat Solomon Gundy. Now, Solomon Gundy is something my dad was very fond of, and he always had a jar of Solomon Gundy, which is like a pickled herring. It is the most disgusting, in my humble opinion, thing in the world. But he used to eat it quite frequently, and he wasn't certainly a drinker. It wasn't for intoxication. He just liked it. But again, different world, different part of the world, and some of the traditions were very, very different. But I laughed when I read that one because it made me really think about my dad and his jar of Solomon Gundy.
That's funny. I've never even heard of that. There are a couple remedies connected to spiders, which is interesting because Nova Scotia doesn't have a lot of spiders, right?
We have spiders, but we don't necessarily have black widow spiders or brown recluse spiders. And Nova Scotia, generally speaking, is a generally benign wilderness. You don't really have a lot of dangerous animals. Don't get too close to a moose when it's got its calf and stuff like that. But we don't really have a lot of rattlesnakes or poisonous spiders or things of that nature. So having moved to the Southwest, again, you become much more familiar with those things. But where I come from in the Northeast, you just really don't run into that very much.
That's probably why, according to Blue Nose Magic, for rheumatism, carry a shell with a spider in it and wear it around your neck. Can you imagine? I mean, that's very Addams Family. I love it. A little spider living in a shell on your, it's like, hi, how are you? And I said, I thought that was really interesting. And also cobwebs rolled up with a lot of dust in them are supposed to be good to dissolve warts.
Yeah. Here's another one that I actually kind of found made me think of home a lot, is that it was for a laxative, actually, rhubarb root. And my mother always grew a rhubarb patch, or she had a big patch with rhubarb that she was growing. And as kids, we would, chow down on the wild rhubarb, raw, and laugh at each other as you made faces because it was incredibly sour. And you had to be careful not to eat too much of it, or the acidity would actually burn your lip and turn it black. So you had to be a little careful with it. But it was one of those treats we would have as a kid. And it was, I guess we never really had problems with constipation very much, so perhaps it worked. But again, I always remember the rhubarb patch that my mom had.
That's really cool. Now, going back to superstitions with fishermen, this one I've never heard about. It has to do with pigs. You're never supposed to say the word pig on a vessel. If you must speak it, you call it gruff. And then the reason is because pigs can see the wind. And I thought, well, how did they figure out that pigs can see the wind? I do know that they're super intelligent. And why do you use the word gruff?
Yeah, I don't really know a whole lot about how that came about, but definitely superstitions involving pigs seem to be very common. Now, some of that may come from Judaic culture to a degree, too, where pork was considered forbidden and God had placed a curse on it, so to speak. So some of that may harken back to some of those religious, underpinnings as well. But yeah, it's one of those things that you would hear commonly back home.
But then an interesting thing is if you, supposedly in the Canadian Navy, if you tattoo a pig on your knee, pig on the knee, safety at sea. So the pig protects you if you tattoo it on the knee. And I've also heard that an octopus on the wrist will protect you from drowning.
Yeah, and that was something that I was in the Canadian Navy when I was 18, and a couple of the old sailors actually had pigs tattooed on their knees. There was no doubt about that. I remember seeing that. And the other superstition they had, or tradition, I guess, was that when you cross the equator, that they would often get their ear pierced, or they would have a little bird tattooed on their between their thumb and index finger to signify that they'd crossed the equator. So that was also another tradition.
Now, we were talking about all these different traditions, superstitions, and remedies, and I did want to mention I came across in a medical journal, I think they were studying a specific culture, I forget which one, and their folk remedies. And yet in the article at the beginning, it talks about why it's important to study. And I wanted to read this quote. It was the Philippines. It's a journal where the article is called Folk Medicine in the Philippines, a phenomenological study of health-seeking individuals. So you can see it's very, very scientific sounding. But it was an interesting quote. The quote is, folk medicine refers to traditional healing practices anchored in cultural beliefs of body physiology and health preservation. Reflective of indigenous heritage, it fosters a better understanding of health and disease, healthcare systems, and biocultural adaptation. So I thought it was really very lovely that they were acknowledging in this article the importance of actually studying it and going, and like Helen did, she went and collected all these stories. And I think it's you don't really think of science doing that, but anthropology people do that. And there are some anthropologists that have been won over to the remedies because they've lived with certain tribes and cultures for decades, and it works.
Yeah, and as I said, she was a really remarkable person. She was actually a war bride. She was from England. She married a Canadian during the Second World War, and I think I remember reading the story about it, that he worked with the military there in England. And at one point, she freaked out and she had a panic attack, and she called up and she insisted that he come home, and she was in such a state that he decided to leave work and go home. And no more did he walk through the door than the phone rang, and they wanted to know if he was still at the office because it had been struck by a German bomb and he would have been killed. And so her intuition, and maybe that's part of what got her fascinated with the paranormal and ghost stories and folklore and things of that nature. But she was an amazing treasure to us, and she kept alive a lot of our traditions back home.
And in what period did she live exactly again?
She was kind of like, again, the early 1900s, particularly. Again, she was a young bride during the war, during the 1940s. And she lived probably up until the 70s. I don't know her exact dates, but it was kind of the early to mid 1900s.
Now, a book I recommend too for even though it's about spiritual cleansing, again, with folk remedies, you have that idea of it blending more with the spirit and the soul of the body, and is Spiritual Cleansing by Dreha Mika Harvick. And all of his remedies are very inexpensive. They're all things you can buy. There's a lot about using eggs for illness in there, though I forget exactly how they are. He's really big on ritual baths, but you do a ritual bath in a very specific way. And my favorite one is for minor evil eye, which he describes as more likely than really being cursed by a person. And so many, we talk a little bit earlier about how the people use like the name of, religious names to help with the healing. And so the same idea of healing the spirit. And I think that there is some evidence that people can die from spiritual malaise, whether it's from a broken heart or that alienation, not feeling a place in the world. I have used the beer bath remedy, and I have noticed a difference in for instance, our business got stronger, which I wasn't doing it for that reason. And I didn't know there were people maybe unconsciously being maybe jealous of some of the things I was doing. I just didn't think, I'm not that big a deal, right? But I suppose little jealousies can't affect things as much as big jealousies.
Yeah, and coming back to the idea of the human heart and the emotional body and so forth, and how that can affect things. There's actually a grave in Lunenburg up near the Academy back in Nova Scotia of this young girl, and you can go visit it. And she had been falsely accused of stealing from her employer. And she was so distraught about being falsely accused that she literally wasted away and died, and so it actually tells the story on her headstone about her death coming from basically being so distraught over being falsely accused of being a thief.
Oh, that's so sad. Now I want to go and visit her grave.
Well, I'll see if I can find you some photos or a video of it somewhere to share it with you, because it's a long trek back to Nova Scotia just to see her grave.
It is. That would be fun to go back there. I look forward to the day that we can. So I did want to mention, since we're big crow lovers, a few superstitions around crows. Some of them are, kind of familiar, and some of them may not be. So one is fishermen don't like a crow to cross their bow. That's supposed to be unlucky. Another is a crow standing on top of a house is a bad omen. Well, I see one every day on someone's house. So, and it's sometimes a single crow. Now, what's interesting about the concept of a solitary crow, there can be some truth in it being sorrow. So there's this little verse: 1 crow's sorrow, 2 crows joy, 3 crows a wedding, 4 crows a boy, 5 crows sixpence, 6 crows gold, 7 crows a secret that's never been told. Now, the single crow, there could be something sorrowful for that, because they're always together. Crows do not like to be away from each other. So if there was some reason the crow was by itself, if nothing else, the crow would be sad, I would think.
Yeah, I would think so. Here's another fun little superstitious game, because as tarot readers, we get asked a lot about love, obviously, and there's no surprise in that. And this is kind of a neat thing. It says, when you sleep in a strange bed, name the bedposts, and the one you dream of will be your future husband. So there's a good task for all of you guys, just the next time you're traveling, to name the bedposts and see if it works.
So it doesn't matter the name of the bedpost. It's just that you're kind of acknowledging that it exists, and it's going to help you find the name of your husband.
Yeah, well, apparently you name them in terms of people you probably know, right? Because you'd have to have some idea of who they are. So you
right.
actually assign different names to your bedpost, and if you happen to dream about the bedpost, now I suppose if you don't dream about the bedpost, that means none of the above, right?
Right.
But it says that when you get it right, you'll actually have a dream that night about the bedpost.
There are so many superstitions about finding love and, picking the petals off a daisy. I love me, he loves me not. There's there was a lot in the Blue Nose Magic too. That could be like a whole show on love spells and magic. And again, it's in a way it's about using your imagination too when it comes to those kinds of superstitions. And you can imagine if you were bored one day, you might even make some things up, and maybe once in a while it would work. And so you think, okay, let's do it again.
Now, and since, Here Krista says, okay, what happens if I don't know anybody? And so I've got a solution for that. In Blue Nose Magic, here's another spell for love. It says, look in a well at midnight on Halloween and you will see the reflection of your future husband. So I guess you'll know what he looks like. If you look in the well on Halloween, you'll see his reflection looking back at you.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and timely, because Halloween is in the not too distant future, so it gives you lots of time to go out and find a well.
Yeah, that itself could be a little challenging in the city.
Yeah, well, okay, then we can fix that too. It says at Halloween, go down cellar backwards and look in the mirror and you will see your future husband. So another form of scrying, and these are all scrying spells basically when it comes right down to it. But so if you don't have access to a well and you can find some place with a basement and you've got a mirror, you're still good.
Mirrors have a lot of superstition around them for sure. So the idea that you break a mirror, you have 7 years of bad luck. Though I did see in Blue Nose Magic, the reason why you cover mirrors after someone dies was if you don't, you'll see the next person that's going to die, which I had thought it was just to cover them so that the person wouldn't haunt you.
Yeah, and that's, again, something that we used to see a lot in Victorian England. People would do that. You don't see it so much anymore, around this part of the world. And same like tea leaf reading was big home, and you don't see it that much in California, or at least Southern California. So, but in Victorian England, this was a very common thing to do.
Yeah. And well, I mean, we all love the mirrors here. Now it's more like the more mirrors, the merrier, it seems like.
Yeah. And I think it's a great idea. I mean, she's got so many different, love magic and love spells and ways to find a husband. I mean, maybe that is going to be a future show. I think we could do a whole show just on that. How
do you find your husband? Through superstition and spells and according to different cultures? Yeah, that would be a really fun show, I think. Well, we all have a little of that. I'm trying to think of what I had. I think I shared the story with people already that I did think for some reason I was going to marry a man named Michael, but it all began because I liked that Joni Mitchell song, Little Green, and the name kind of stuck with me. And there was a period in my 20s I actually looked for people named Michael, and I met one and he was not the Michael, and then I just completely forgot about it. I thought, well, why did I even think that? I remember thinking, like, that's crazy, Krista, and went on to date other people not named Michael. But then when I actually did get married to Michael, it came back to me. I said, oh my God, I was right. It's like the only specific psychic thing I think I've ever had happen that was, like a name specific thing that actually came true in my life.
Yeah, but I think, again, part of magic is just letting it go and getting about your life and not dwelling on it. So I think that always kind of seems to me to be a key in all of this stuff working. So I know we're getting close to wrapping up. We only have a couple minutes left. So I'm going to get ready to wrap up the show. So I'm going to kick it back to you to take us into the end of it, Krista. So whatever last few superstitions and magic and so forth you want to leave us with.
Well, going back to the idea of knowing the name of who you're going to get married, I did read that certain Native Americans, the parents would know the names of the people that their children would marry, and everyone knew it. I forget if it was a North American tradition. I came across this when I was reading, and it was just a common thing, and it was no big deal. And I have a very, very tiny bit of Native American on my mother's side. I don't know how much, but it's very, very small. And so I thought maybe that's that little bit speaking through me. But it's one of those things I recommend. Actually, it was really a lot of fun reading about folk remedies and superstitions because it makes you think about it. I chuckled about some things. Some of it was kind of scary. Some of it is something you might think yourself anyway, like it's bad luck to kill a ladybug. Who wouldn't say that? Everyone loves ladybugs, and they really do help get rid of pests in gardens. So of course that made sense, But then there was some strange omens, and because I think I'm a little bit of a superstitious type person, I have to be a little careful not to go overboard with these ideas. But having lived with both a black cat and a black crow for many years, you can tell, like we said earlier, that some of it is all about context and what you believe and what your cultural roots are, or what you decide to adopt as your spiritual beliefs too, because I certainly didn't grow up in terms of like as a pagan or anything in particular. So a lot of it is connected to that, but I think there's some truth with some of the remedies. I think that, that's why they're used time and time again. So I hope you enjoyed this show. Join us next time as we continue to explore the esoteric and the obscure together. Have a magical and superstitious week.